Hi, I'm Caroline, and today I'm going to talk about the need to think of freedom as a political value, but as a dynamic and ambiguous abstract concept rather than merely defining it under one common definition. At the origin of political thought, freedom is thought and compared to spontaneity. The philosopher Kant, he compared men's freedom of will to that of freedom and explained that there are causal variables, including that of the environment per se, that affect one's freedom and one's notion of freedom. Today I want to discuss freedom as a political value. To put this into context, other political values are equality and justice, and political values can be studied through political disagreements, and a political disagreement can be examined through what we call application. This implies what happens on the ground, and I want to stress that considering the idea of application, we cannot merely study a concept that is as ambiguous and as abstract as freedom under the guise of a written constitution. Anyway, when we think of freedom, we often think of what we want to accomplish, and limitations on freedom can easily help others to think of what constitutes an appropriate desire. When we think of freedom, we also think of an appropriate desire, and there also exists excessive desire, inappropriate desire that does not take into account the interests of others. Criticisms of freedom often arise when constraints are put on freedom, but in reality, these constraints and these limitations allow others to gather a comprehensive understanding of what their freedom is and what their capabilities are. And when we think of freedom, we often think of a state's relation to oppression, and so we want to consider this comparative idea, the nature of an oppressive relation between one state and another when we compare the notion of freedom in different states. But it's very on brand of liberal democracies to impose their own definitions of freedom onto that of non-democratic states, and it is undeniable that non-democratic states have their own concepts of freedom. There's this scenario that was brought forth by this professor at Princeton that really just shows how dynamic freedom is and how easily influenced it is by causal variables. In this scenario, there are this group of slaves, and they are seemingly content with not being free, but their slave owner has coerced them into not being exposed to the idea of freedom as a viable concept. And so this goes to show how the idea of coercion, how this is a causal variable and affects our notion of our own freedoms. And I also want to mention, would we be able to conceptualize freedom had we not witnessed injustices and inequality? Well, I've mentioned that it's very on brand for Western liberal democracies to try to impose their own definitions of freedom in non-democratic states. It is important to remember to think of the history of the third wave of democratization that the United States took part in the early 20th century, specifically in Latin America. The United States sought to democratize non-democratic, some communist countries in South America, and while it was widely unsuccessful, it goes to show that coercion and biases play a huge role. We are biased, and I am biased, and you are biased, and we often impose our own expectations that are aligned with our political ideologies on the idea of freedom in other states. I'm going to briefly talk about the history of freedom in the Middle East. In the beginning of the 7th century, when Islam first emerged, a central tenet of it was equality, and the Quran also laid forth guidelines for local rulers on how to rule. And a central tenet also as well was to rule according to the divine law. And while establishing a duty to obey, there also was established a duty to disobey. And in reality, this allowed for more of a right to revolution than in Western liberal democracies. When the French general Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Egypt, he did so under the name of liberty and equality, but this confused many Egyptians because the Arabic term for freedom, ouriye, confused my pronunciation, was not politicized. And so it was deduced that the Western idea of government could be separated into freedom and slavery, whereas in the Arab world and historically, it was thought of as good government versus bad government. And while historically means of government in governing in the Middle East took a turn towards authoritarianism, and ensuing pieces of literature were on the idea for order, it became very on brand for Western liberal democracies to criticize this order. And so it's inevitable that Western political thought surrounding the concept of freedom is very different than that in non-democratic states. Historical concept is incredibly important when analyzing freedom. And take, for example, the liberalist origins of the concept of freedom and justice in the Middle East. However, Western imperialism and its quest to democratize non-democratic states without much regard to varying cultural contexts. Take, for example, the beginning of Western presence in the Arab region as the Arab region sought to modernize itself. And after the Second World War, there existed a political vacuum in Syria in which the British began the centuries-long, the decades-long presence of Western forces in the Middle East. And so there began a history of repression. So this Western imperialism and the ongoing quest to democratize non-democratic states without much regard to these varying cultural contexts has allowed for this growing distrust and repression in areas such as the Middle East. And I just wanted to finish off by emphasizing how important it is to think of freedom more as a dynamic and ambiguous concept rather than putting it under one box. And it is important, again, that we analyze the historical context of a political system of a place before we impose our biases on it. Thank you.